I am so honored and excited to welcome Dr. Ruslana Westerlund to the podcast. I have admired and been inspired and have been mentored by you from afar for many years. And I know that you're close colleagues with one of my besties in education, Beth Skelton. I call her Dr. Beth Skelton. Um,
Mhm.
so she has learned a lot from you, and she keeps talking about you. And I'm so excited to have you on the podcast to share all your wisdom from your experience with WIDA and making language accessible and then structuring language. Dr. Ruslan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So the concept of SFL, or systemic functional linguistic, they learned it in the universities, or I've really never heard about it until I started learning about your work. Can you provide a brief overview of what this is for listeners, please?
hmm So in a not in a, so yeah, this theory has been around in the United States, but fairly recent. Originally, it comes from Australia, but in a nutshell, the idea is that we have um, applicable linguistics, not applied, but applicable, easily applicable linguistics in education, whose author was Halliday and Ruqayya Hassan, who helped really develop the context and the systemic part of functional linguistics. So they both equal partners in developing the theory. And in basically what they wanted to do is they wanted to have a linguistics that was useful enough to eradicate social inequalities related to class and race. So the previous versions of linguistics kind of lived at the inventory of structures, language acquisition device. Their theory was to combat social inequalities from the beginning, not in. So the Halliday always said all linguistics is sociolinguistics. Practically speaking, SFL is a theory of language that makes language visible, and it positions language and meaning together. So which structures do we need to enact which meanings? So the mapping of meanings onto structures is really important. Do we want to create objective mathematical meanings? Do we want to create emotive, evaluative meanings in argumentation, in persuasion? And if we are pursuing those meanings, then what linguistic structures do we need to enact those meanings? So that's still very abstract, but as we go through more questions, I will provide a few more concrete examples.
Well, can you paint for us a picture of what that would look like when you walk into a classroom that's
Mm,
using
systemic.
systemic functional linguistics? What does that look like compared to other classes
Yeah.
that don't use that?
So I would say the way I taught without systemic functional linguistics, and of course it's all contextual and historical. So in the 90s, when I was teaching, after I immigrated from Ukraine in 95, I was teaching either a worksheet with past tense verbs or a worksheet with synonyms, or I was pre-teaching some vocab words that would show up in the lesson later. So that's a pretty typical 90s pedagogy. I believe in the 2000s, we switched into integration of content and language. And personally, if you ask my opinion, the content took over. And language teachers have forgotten to be language teachers because of the other mandates placed on them, not because of their fault. So now they are either reteaching content or simplifying content or helping students with homework or becoming interventionists. So that's a larger problem that I don't think SFL can fix. But if SFL is used in a classroom, for example, I'm going to use my own example. Students in third grade were learning about electricity. So it's a content area classroom in which English learners are full members and participants. And they are learning electricity. They're talking about their experiences with electricity. They're building an electric circuit. And typically without SFL, after they experience, the teacher would say, okay, here's your science journal. Go write about how electricity works. So in that That's a typical content classroom. When SFL is used and its corresponding pedagogy, genre pedagogy, then the teacher debriefs the experience with students and writes down language for either recounting an experiment, just so we can debrief the experience. And then there would be an opportunity to say, well, for us to communicate what we learned about it, it's not enough just to recount an experience. We have to distance ourselves from that experience and talk about electricity as an abstract concept, because that's a cross-discipline, that's a cross-cutting concept, energy and matter in NGSS. So then the teacher would say, the summative genre here is an explanation, and I will show you how science explanations are written. So they use a different topic that everybody knows already, and they deconstruct a mentor text of a science explanation, which can be 3 or 4 sentences. And then they jointly construct, paying attention to the language of causality. This cycle and this lesson that I'm referring to is in the article on Colorín Colorado published in May. And you will see in the center of the article the teaching and learning cycle. And I often say, if you're referencing the teaching and learning cycle, I use metaphors and colors. And I say, typically, kids are asked to they jump from red to green. Red is we had an experience, we talked about it, and green, go write about it. Because there is an assumption that if kids had figured out the answer in math, or they understood electricity from experience, they're ready to write about it. And that there is not enough macro scaffolding. So typically teachers will give a graphic organizer or a sentence frame, and that is called scaffolding, which is a problematic definition of scaffolding, because you have to literally apprentice students to the genre, which is new to them because these are genres of schooling. And through the genre pedagogy, macro scaffolding is provided through a very tight sequencing of learning events and activities, and very careful attention to language in the service of the genre, so that they are apprenticed to communicate their knowledge on the topic of electricity or magnetism or global warming, or you name it.
Right. So it seems like the old model of working with multilinguals, particularly writing instruction, is I'm going to assign you. We're going to do an activity together, and then I'll assign you the writing task. Go write. Now that you experienced snowflakes, now that you experienced digging up fossils, now that you experienced the Industrial Revolution by working on the assembly line, go write about it. But you're saying SFL is systemic functional linguistic, is moving to us teaching how to write through an apprentice model.
Yes. Yeah, you nailed it. Maria Brisk uses the phrase or a sentence, writing is assigned and not taught.
Yes.
And that's exactly what you said.
Yes, exactly. And that's the mistake. It seems like why not do worksheets? Because I know a lot of teachers use worksheets as models of approaches to teaching grammar and language.
Well, if we look at language as a meaning-making resource and language in the service of learning, then we have to position language and the structures that we need alongside the content learning and disciplinary practices and core ideas. So, because the worksheet takes the language away from the learning experience. And the worksheet may include more things than the kids will ever need.
Right.
So if they only need causal language to show the relationship of what causes what to happen in this example of electricity, then we can teach them the causal language right there on the board by highlighting it, underlining it, and showing how in science causality is expressed.
Right.
Because in social studies, causality may be expressed in arguments and explanations. In social studies,
Right.
causality may be expressed with very different resources.
Right.
And in a third grade classroom, it's expressed through clauses, if then, or when this, it leads to this, or as the roller coaster goes up, this happens, when we were studying kinetic and potential energy in a classroom before COVID. So in that way, the worksheet becomes irrelevant because it removes the language away from the experience.
Right.
And so your mentor text becomes your repository of language features to teach. And the key with mentor text is that it needs to resemble the summative genre.
Right.
And deconstructed for key language resources, not just, oh, let's notice transition words. Well, if the kids may know how to use transition words, what they may not know is how to communicate ideas precisely. Like the positive side of the battery, the negative side of the battery. That's precision in that case.
Right.
Or the verbs, is transferred, is conducted. So, and those are, of course, passive voice, because we don't need to worry about the agent. It's what's happening.
Right.
So you have to look at the resources that you need to communicate those meanings in science.
Yeah. So we talked about what you basically said, that worksheets help students memorize language, but not use language. We're just, it's in isolation.
Yeah.
Like we're learning grammar in isolation. There's no context for it. And then,
yeah.
So let's move to graphic organizers. You mentioned graphic organizers before, and how are they used ineffectively, and then why not use them as much?
Actually, graphic organizers are still helpful.
Yes.
However, they are helpful when they're used as students need to learn how to communicate their knowledge through this disciplinary genre. But the ineffective use of graphic organizers typically is kind of okay, well, I don't know how to help them, so here's a graphic organizer. As opposed to let's deconstruct the mentor text and then use the graphic organizer as we're jointly constructing a summative genre. And then you can continue using it when you're writing independently. So the graphic organizer then is used throughout the cycle, and it matches, the structure of the graphic organizer matches the organizational structure of the whole text. Or it's a graphic organizer of causes and effects, which we often use. But now we are attaching language to it, and we're using it to show how causality is expressed, and it can be communicated graphically like this in a graphic organizer. So it just has to be positioned closer to the learning activities, and other learning activities needs to be in place, such as deconstruction, joint construction, in order for that graphic organizer to be actually more useful. Other uses of graphic organizers are anchor charts. So anchor charts of language features that students need for the summative genre can be a helpful scaffold, so to say. And it's probably a little different than a graphic organizer, but it kind of goes along with it because it shows kids the visibility of language in the service of that summative genre. The causal verbs, complex sentences to connect ideas of how they connect causes and effects, and your expanded noun groups to add precision, in this case, science explanations. And passive voice construction, which is very difficult to learn. So instead of treating passive voice on a worksheet, you are attending to passive voice in the text you're deconstructing and jointly constructing.
You've mentioned that many times, deconstruction, co-construction. So that's part of the teaching learning cycle. Can you share what that is with teachers who are not familiar with that? Like go through each one really slowly.
Yes. So
and give an example.
Yeah. So in this same article, if you want to have a visual reference, it's called Figure 1, the teaching and learning cycle for disciplinary genres, and it has those colors. So the blue one, planning with the end in mind at the very top, that's where you start with the standards and your performance task or your summative assessment or end of unit assessment. And immediately there and then you identify what is the summative genre that matches the performance task. For example, if the kid, what will kids be doing? How will they be communicating their knowledge at the end? Will they be explaining how electricity works, or will they be retelling how they created an electric circuit? Those are two different genres. One is a procedural recount, another one is a causal explanation. Most of the time, teachers have a hard time. Teachers that I've trained have told me that it's very hard for them to identify the summative genre in the performance task. So no wonder the kids are confused because they don't even know what that may look like. So I work with teachers to help them identify the summative genre that comes from the performance task. Once you've identified your destination, so far it sounds like backwards design or planning with the end in mind. Yes. Yeah, see, that's right. So that's your schema we're working with here, if you know backwards design. Then you go into, okay, now we need to build knowledge on the topic, because knowledge on the topic is, you can't write if you haven't researched it. You can, you think you know it, but you really have to research and study and experience these ideas. So building knowledge about the field is the red phase in the cycle. And it's reading for knowledge building, viewing, talking about it, going outside and experiencing snow melting on the sidewalk, or you name it. And then having this anchoring if either phenomenon in science or anchoring experience to the degree that it's possible. And note-taking and organizing information, taking lots of notes on what you are learning. And that's where graphic organizers come in handy too, to organize your learning. And then the phases of orange and yellow are typically missing from the pedagogy that I have experienced since 95. It's where you remember the summative genre you identified in the blue. And now you're like, okay, kids, for us to communicate our knowledge, we're going to do it in this genre. And you provide a mentor text that kids' writing levels. I have used Magic School AI and ChatGPT to generate really great mentor texts. It's a huge time saver. Yes, and then we deconstruct the text. We cut it up. We underline noun groups, whatever the language features that are prevalent for that genre and that students need to develop. That's the work. The orange phase, deconstruction, is learning the language of the genre. Then we jointly construct it. And we can do this work in large whole class, how I've done teaching theme interpretation essay in a fourth grade classroom. We as researchers actually taught using this pedagogy right before COVID shut down schools. And or you can do joint construction in small groups or both. You start with the whole class. One thing I've noticed that teachers confuse joint construction with is shared writing or a language experience approach. So shared writing and joint construction are two different things. Joint construction is negotiation of meaning together and crafting the text together to match the summative genre.
Can you give us an example of what that looks like?
Yeah. So kids, teachers would say, okay, how should we start this? What is the purpose of the text we're writing? The kids would who are trained in genre pedagogy, they would say the purpose is to explain how electricity works. Okay, how should we start the sentence? The kids go, it didn't work. Okay, all right. So what do we mean by it? Remember, we're writing for someone who was not with us in this experiment. Imagine someone writing a children's blog or reading your blog written by a third grader, how electricity works. Okay, so you're writing for your peers who've never done this before. So you have to name your things. What do you mean by it? And they can say, oh, it didn't work because I put too much tape on it. All right, let's back up a little bit. At the very beginning, when you open your blog, what should we say? What is this blog about? Oh, this is about electricity. And I will tell you how electricity works. Okay, we can start with that. So so children give you contributions and you together teach them how to recontextualize their contributions, how to revise them so that they match the audience and the mode and the topic.
So it's
Those
like,
are the three main variables, including the purpose, the fourth one, the genre. In systemic functional linguistics, we define context very precisely. Who are we writing to? What is the purpose for writing? Where does the language work? What's the mode? What's the channel of communication? And what's the topic? Is it electricity, magnetism, or butterflies? Because the vocabulary and language around it will follow
right,
that topic.
right.
After joint construction, now we're going to green.
Oh, wait,
This is
I still have a question about joint construction. So how long does that go for?
mhm,
Let me summarize what I hear though. Students are giving ideas. You are prompting them to, the teacher
mhm,
is prompting them to give
yeah,
ideas. Students are giving you ideas. Then instead of the teacher writing those ideas, the teacher is recrafting or recasting what they're saying
mhm.
in the teacher's language. Like, yes, instead of saying it, we're going to say uh,
Electricity.
electricity, right? The positive side of the battery. Boom.
Mhm,
Right.
mhm.
Okay.
And often those recasts can come from other students.
Yes.
The teacher doesn't have to do all the recasting, but
Mm,
this is the crux of the dialogic teaching. And this is also defined as micro scaffolding, or Luciana de Oliveira and others call it interactional scaffolding, where the scaffolding comes through the conversation about language
right.
and concepts. And then students further clarify their understandings, what they thought they understood. Like, why didn't it work? Because I put too much tape on it. Well, what does that mean? So you're both clarifying conceptual or deepening conceptual knowledge and language at the same time. So that's this reciprocity of language and learning and content together that happens in this dialogic move of recasting, reformulating, elaborating, clarifying, and the whole class is engaged in this work. So the next phase is then individual construction, and I intentionally call it individual, not independent, because a lot of students might still need more work, or they could do this in pairs, or they could do this with a teacher, because not everything we teach has to be assessed, right? So, some summative pieces can be more independent, just to really see what have students learned, or they can be individual. In Luciana's version of this cycle, she actually adds, because she works in like real first grade, second grade classrooms a lot. She does do work K-12, but she adds collaborative writing, where there is more support, more scaffolding through collaborative writing that happens in individual construction. And the final phase is analysis and reflection. And I had to add this to the original teaching and learning cycle.
Before we go to the analysis and
Yeah.
reflection, can we talk about so you have joint construction, the teacher is leading the whole group or in small group.
Yes.
Then students are maybe working in pairs or small groups to do that. What scaffolds do you have to get students to
Yeah.
work on a new text
Mm-hmm.
um, together?
Excellent question. When we did this work in a fourth grade classroom, so I'm drawing on my own experiences of going through this, not just reading and writing about it. All of the work from text deconstruction and joint construction, all your notes, your anchor charts of language features, your glued sentences complex sentences with causality, or your whole text that's deconstructed and highlighted. All of those resources are then used in independent construction. Also, in joint construction, we jointly constructed a rubric that kids had their input into. The rubric included the genre stages and on the left, and the language features that are needed for those genre stages on the right. And so those tools were used then and as supports, as their tools to continue drawing on and constructing their own text independently. Right. You also had a question about how long it takes. So it really depends, right? So it depends on, is the genre brand new to the kids? How many lessons on text deconstruction do we need? In our experience, when we were doing a theme interpretation essay in 4th grade with Sharon Besser, I think we had about 6 to 8 hour-long lessons on deconstruction alone, because theme interpretation essay is a type of argument, and it's first time. It's not your chocolate milk opinion essay, which I'm a huge critic of. It's actually disciplinary, very demanding argument writing, where you have to identify the theme and support your theme with textual evidence. So because it was a brand new genre for 4th graders, we had to do a lot of text deconstruction, several lessons. Joint construction was probably 6 or 7 lessons. The whole unit on that genre was, I think, 12 weeks or so, including the celebration and everything. So yeah, this is not, let's circle some transition words and we did deconstruction. It's real language work that takes time.
Right. So if it takes 6 lessons, where's the output the students are doing? It looks like input the students they're understanding the sequence of ideas, they're understanding the sentence structure. When are they producing it if it's 6 days, 6 lessons of that?
They're not producing it until the individual construction. And one teacher told us, they're not writing. Why aren't they writing? And we said, they're not ready yet. So they may be highlighting language and manipulating language, and like manipulatives in terms of, but they're not writing the genre. They're still being apprenticed to it. So I always compare it to, if you're learning a new life skill, you are standing next to that apprentice for weeks. Watching them, assisting them, just watching, doing something together. But if somebody like an electrician was just watching somebody do electricity for 3 days and then they came to my house to install a fan, no, thank you. They're not ready for independent work. Apprenticeship in trades needs to come into classrooms, because that's how we learn.
Right. That makes sense. No, thank you. Don't come and fix my fan.
Yeah,
Install my fan after 3 days.
Right? So okay, final phase is in teal. It's called analysis and reflection. And I added this phase to the cycle. The original cycle came from Joan Rothery, whom I met. She's Australian, in her late 80s now. They created this pedagogy in Australian classrooms after they've observed that children weren't apprenticed. Children were struggling, and so there was a class of struggling writers, especially Aboriginal children who were always struggling. And so I used that word in quotes because of the pedagogy that was placed on them. It wasn't a pedagogy of promise, it was pedagogy of struggle, basically. Many of us who work with the teaching and learning cycle, we are indebted to Joan Rothery and Bev Derevyanka and Pauline Jones, who have continued to develop it. And so we are just recontextualizing it based on our work. When I was doing research before COVID, I found that teachers were too busy to analyze and reflect on the work that they've collected from students. And I said, well, if we're not really analyzing and reflecting, then how can we make instructional steps for the next unit that we're working on? So I had to explicitly add it to the cycle to draw attention to how important it is to review the work that students have produced. And sometimes teachers have asked, how do you choose what to look for, what to look at, what to analyze? And I said, well, if you are covering causality and conceptual knowledge, or if students can add precision, then you have three things to look at. Number one, is their science knowledge accurate? Have they got really developed conceptual understanding of magnetism in this case? Number two, can they communicate precision? And that in this case, it was in noun groups and in the passive voice verbs. And the third one was, can they communicate what causes what to happen through either a compound sentence or whichever way they were able to communicate that. And that, so you focus on the thing you deconstructed for. If you deconstructed for those three things, you jointly construct, drawing students' attention for those three things. And then in the analysis and reflection, those are your three areas.
So as I was thinking about this is what happens when you have beginners or elementary school students going through this process? I guess those are two different questions. Beginners, like new to English,
Yeah.
and then elementary school students who.
Yeah, so both of these examples are from elementary school students. The article in Coloring Colorado is from third grade science. And the stories I was telling about the theme interpretation essay was fourth grade. And we basically, yeah. And in each of those instances, we had newcomers. In the science classroom, the newcomer chose to write in Spanish. And she had solid conceptual understanding of science, and her language followed. And in the theme interpretation essay, fourth grade, we had newcomers at the end of level 1. I'm not sure how newcomers are defined, but what we found is that students can participate in meaningfully if you are supporting them through all the cycles of the teaching and learning. So they can experience, they can see science, they can experience science. Science is extremely exciting for kids. And then you are very selectively provide language to, so if it's for them at the level of 2 sentences, the electric circuit, they can learn the electric circuit. They can say electric circuit, articles are whatever, they'll come later. Electricity is transmitted. We can work with that. We can construct a compound sentence when too much tape, it didn't work, or it doesn't work, or it no work, right? So the science content is in the language is in the service of science. And then we gradually develop students' language resources, but we don't foreclose them from it just because they're newcomers.
Right, exactly. When you work with teachers who are starting to use the teaching and learning cycle this way, what advice do you recommend for them? Or like what common things that oh, this is their interpretation of it, but really this is the way they should be doing it?
They often look at it before they get into the work and they say, we do this already. I hear that a lot. And then I ask them, how do you do it? Can I see it? And that's when we get into the conversation. Well, your performance task is a macro genre. there is too many genres going on. Kids actually will get very, very confused with that. So let's start by clarifying your performance task and really honing in on genres that arise from the curriculum, that are relevant to student lives. Relevancy is really important. Because there are so many issues in the community that you can relate student interests to and draw on, and that can realize themselves, like, let's create a brochure for why we need to create pollinator gardens. Yes. And that brochure will have the genre of persuasion. Brochure is not a genre, it's just a place mode or format where the genre will live. So that the confusion also comes when teachers look at this, when we talk about, because genre becomes like really important here, the notion of genre. So they will say, oh, they'll write a blog. I said, blog is a format. Will they be informing, explaining, persuading, inquiring? What would be the genre for the blog or genre for brochure? So we quickly clarify what's a format and what is a genre. And then I've also heard teachers say, yep, I use mentor texts. I said, well, tell me how. Well, the kids have them. They have them in their student notebooks. Okay, so these kids have access to them, but do they know how to look at a mentor text as a text they can learn from? What activities do you do for students to learn the organizational structure beyond introduction, body, and conclusion? Don't get me started on how problematic that is, because different genres are organized very differently. And we can talk another hour on that topic, that introduction, body, and conclusion is a very unuseful structure for a lot of texts, because explanations don't need introduction, body, and conclusion. Many of them. So we have conversations about what is the structure of the genre in the mentor text and how can you make that accessible and explicit to your students? So I begin to ask questions back to some of the responses, like, well, I do that already. I use mentor texts, and kids will write a blog.
Oh, right. Yes. Just because they have a mentor text.
Yes.
So you're really talking about in the planning in the end, you're not identifying the platform. Yes, we have a blog, but what's the language function that students are going to be using, right? And so is it compare, contrast? Is it to evaluate? Yes.
So we actually go to the genre level, not just the function. Functions are kind of within. So we're asking how will we communicate our knowledge at the end? Will it be a persuasion for community members? And then you can have functions to, like, oh, introduce a claim or support your claim with evidence. So that's where the language functions and features from the WIDA standards can come in, because they're organized in genre families. Narrate, inform, explain, and argue are genre families. And then you have language features that make those more visible, and kind of they unpack the genres.
Makes sense. This is my final question. This has been very enlightening so far. You're an excellent explainer of the very abstract process, but I love how it apprentices students. My final question is, I notice you use a lot of technical terms of language, such as like expanded noun groups. Like, what's your argument for using those words? Do you use those words with students, even young ones and newcomers?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I know teachers who've been trained by me, they also use meta language like that. And what's really powerful is that you can create your own meta language with students. You don't have to use some extremely technical meta language that was written for different purposes, because the research community needs its own set of meta language. Your classroom community can co-construct your own terms. So one teacher was using like long noun groups, she said. So instead of saying, and this is shout out to Elizabeth Folberg because was the first one in my SFL research who really took off with it and done amazing things. And her text is in the WIDA standards on page 100, that she worked with students on green anoles, which are lizards. And so she was teaching kids how to expand a noun group. So green anoles with sticky toe scales, because the precision was lived in those noun groups. So she told them, we need to have a way of naming these structures because they were critical for communicating their ideas. So it's either long noun groups or expanded noun groups. The power is to name things explicitly so then you can talk about them. Like we have terms for talking about math. We have, mathematical meta language. We also have linguistic meta language. It's the same thing. But for some reason, mathematical meta-language is not being questioned as much as words like nominalization in cohesion. There is an article by Meg Gebhardt that she writes about middle schoolers, and they were having a conversation about meta-language. And so, okay, kids, how should we name nominalization in a different way? And one student raises her hand and says, Miss, nominalization is nominalization. Kids actually
We can learn it.
learn those terms faster
Yeah.
because they don't come with the baggage that we do
Yeah.
from structural linguistics
Yeah.
and diagramming sentences,
Right. Right.
PTSD kind of stuff.
PTSD trauma, yes. So I see this as an approach when I was applying, if I was to apply this in my classroom, I would teach expanded noun groups first in the concept of how students how to read it, how to write it, how to see it in deconstruction. And then
Yeah.
we say, we've been doing this for weeks now. This is just called expanded noun groups.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be calling this expanded noun groups from now on.
Yes.
But the kids have a context for it. We don't
Yeah,
start
I
with it.
love that.
Right.
Yes, create
Right.
the context for it and then create a label for it.
Right. Right. Once they understand the concept first.
Yes.
Yes. Tell me
Yes.
about, let's go back to I know I said it's the last question, but it's not. And this will be the one. Tell me about the text deconstruction. How long does that take? And like, can you walk me through what that looks like?
Mm-hmm. So in this one example from theme interpretation essay, which I just have the best memories of, we wrote up mentor text. This was before ChatGPT, so there is admiration for people who wrote their own mentor texts. And we had it cut up. We talked about the social purpose of the text and how the text unfolds to meet its purpose. Kids were holding paragraphs and standing in front of the classroom and lining themselves up in order of how the text unfolds. And why? Why is a brief summary of the book has to be at the beginning and not at the end? Because the reader who's reading your theme interpretation essay needs to have a glimpse of what the book is about before they read about, oh, the theme is whatever, be yourself or proud of who you are, right? So, well, let's give a little synopsis, a little summary of Mixed Up Chameleon, so that then the rest of the text will make sense. So the kids deconstruct text, either cutting it up, holding paragraphs, or underlining how ideas develop, or all of those things. With newcomers, I would cut up key sentences. And I would also talk about how you would maybe represent ideas in ways that are at their level, but they're still talking about things, be proud of who you are. But the sentences and the words will be at their level, but they're participating with everyone in deconstructing and underlining and focusing on language in the context of text.
Got it. Oh, Dr. Ruslana Westerlund I know you're currently writing a book about making WIDA standards more accessible to teachers.
Yeah, language toolkit.
Yes. This one needs to be your second book. You're so thoughtful in the way you explain it, so clear in the way you help us understand. This would be another book to really
Thank
help
you. Thank you
further the
so much.
field. It has definitely helped further my understanding. So thank you so much.
I appreciate this opportunity. I'm thankful for your work too, and I respect so much your daily work with kids, and just profoundly honored to be here to share what I've learned, having started as an ESL teacher back in the 90s. So I'm privileged that I had an opportunity to share what I've learned with other teachers.
Well, we're privileged to gain from your years of experience. We are sitting at the feet of the sage and taking it all in. So thank you so much.
Thanks.